Hi, welcome everybody. We're going to get started since it's 7 o'clock. I'm going to first go through a few announcements and then we'll hand it over to Erik. So first, so a few basic announcements. Please remain muted so not to distract everyone else. Save your questions until the end, either type in the chat box, or we'll be unmuting people at the end so that Erik can get your great questions. And if you have any technical difficulties, we assume that you won't be on here, so feel free to email us at info@wigglybevo.org, or feel free to message us as well. If you live in the area, we would love to have more volunteers to help spread native plants in the region and help monitor nest boxes and many other great things about birds, native plants, or insects. Our native plant sale is running right now and will continue until April 15th. And our amazing supplier, Johnson's, you'll be hearing from Erik today. And we have both woody and herbaceous plants from two different suppliers. So also love to thank our supporters, Johnson's being among them. And then we're going to be hosting a bunch more webinars this spring and a bunch of trainings. So our next webinar is a panel discussion talking about gardening with native plants. And then we'll be talking about green infrastructure in May. And without further ado, I'm going to briefly stop sharing and introduce Erik before switching it over. So Erik Desotelle is our presenter this evening, and he has a bachelor's degree from UW-Stevens Point in urban forestry and currently works at Johnson's Nursery as a wholesale salesperson and is really knowledgeable about so many of their plants, and we've been just really impressed by his knowledge. He also teaches at Gateway Technical College and is just a really amazing guy. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Erik. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much. Can everyone hear me all right?
Yes, I can hear you.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for the kind introduction. I'm really excited to be here talking with all of you tonight about how we can use natives in our landscapes. Tonight's talk is titled Beyond the Flowerbed, and it's just really great to be a part of this. I think what the organization is doing is awesome, and it's amazing to see so many people involved in this. It's great. So today we're talking about how to use natives in the landscape. And I apologize if my voice goes hoarse. I've been talking a lot today, so stretch out those vocal cords more, I guess. So real quick, why plant natives, right? This is what we're here to talk about. We have to talk about why we want to be doing what we're doing out there. So some of the benefits that are associated with natives is that they are an active participant in a landscape's ecosystem. You know, we can plant non-natives like ginkgo or dawn redwood, two trees that I love and adore, but at the same time, those plants don't really support anything in the landscape. There's nothing that feeds on them. The only thing that marginally uses them would be deer scraping up on them, but that's a totally different issue. Natives can be aesthetically pleasing. You know, they can have a really beautiful flowering habit. They can have a wonderful texture or bark. Striped maple, a really cool understory native tree, really cool buds and bark on that. Or fall color on a native serviceberry. There's lots of wonderful options with that. And they're better adapted to our soils and climates. You know, I mean, what better way to prepare yourself for the site that we're dealing with than co-evolving with everything out there over the span of, well, I guess in Wisconsin, it's 10,000 years because we did have that whole glaciation thing. But the problem is that these aren't just borderline or just like across the board goods and bads out there, right? There's two ways we can look at it. We've got plants being a participant in the landscape's ecosystem as long as the other components of that ecosystem will take advantage of that plant. You know, I can't take wintergreen from a tamarack bog in central Wisconsin, or excuse me, northern central Wisconsin, and bring that down to like a prairie in southeastern Wisconsin or southwestern Wisconsin or northern Illinois and expect it to do anything, because A, it's not going to grow there because the soil isn't right, there's too much sun, and B, there isn't anything out there that's co-evolved with that. Natives can be aesthetically pleasing, absolutely, but they can also be ugly as all get out. That's the reason why we've got cultivars and nativars of different plants, because not all natives are perfect. And I'm not going to say that they are absolutely gorgeous at all times. Yes, there's a certain subtlety to them that I absolutely love, but we can't just say across the board that natives are always beautiful, because there's times when they look pretty crappy, honestly. So we have to take the good with the bad on those. And they can be better adapted to our soils and climate, except for when our soils aren't the same, especially in the case of an urban site. I mean, adapted to our soils means that they've adapted to the natural development of our landscape over the past 10,000 years after the glaciers receded. They haven't adapted to the urban jungle or an area where soil's been so compacted that its bulk density is over 1.8 or even above 2 in some cases, for all you soils nerds out there. And layman's terms, that just means that it's basically a brick, except it's soil instead of a brick, but it's the same density out there. But that's not the kind of environment that natives are adapted to. And there's climate change going on here where we can't just say that, oh yeah, natives belong here, they're good to go, because we're starting to see a push of plants that were on the southern end of their range being pushed further north. So there are problems with that. I mean, looking at this space here, we've got a natural landscape, sort of. We've got a utility right of way. We've got tamaracks entering this low space out here, and we've got some some lupine growing up on the slopes up here. But this is, Tomahawk, Wisconsin. This is sandy, pretty coarsely textured soil with really sharp drainage. These lower sites have lots of available moisture. These upper sites are super dry. I'm not really going to get by with throwing a bunch of snowberry out here, which loves dry alkaline clay. Nor am I going to be able to do the opposite and take red maples from this site and plant them in a prairie in southwestern Wisconsin. So it's a give and take on that. We can't just view natives as this perfect for every place problem or perfect for every place solution. There are issues with that, and just throwing them everywhere, because the only thing worse than a native is a dead native, except for if that dead native is providing habitat. But again, everything depends. Everything's all over the place. There's no right or wrong answers. Everything's subjective, yada, yada, yada. But I'm not just over here saying, oh, you all should just jump on planting privet and, all sorts of other invasive stuff because, hey, the environment sucks anyways, so don't bother planting anything nice. That's not at all the point that I'm making here. But what I am trying to say is that this here, a big, beautiful bur oak, hundreds of years old in a natural prairie setting, doesn't fix this, which is acres and acres, if not miles upon square miles of impermeable surfaces all throughout southeastern Wisconsin. One native tree isn't going to solve this. There are bigger issues at play here. Having said that, planting natives is hugely important. It's one of the best things that you as an individual can do. But don't forget that there's a lot of other stuff that needs to get worked on as well, and don't pat yourself on the back too early with all that. So natives are great, but again, treating them like a panacea ignores the bigger issues of site conditions and looking at the surrounding ecology. Planting an oak tree doesn't fix a destroyed soil. Planting a chokecherry won't bring back the passenger pigeon. And installing a rain garden will not erase decades of environmental injustice. Dead plants, again, don't help except for when they're habitat, but it's a totally separate issue here. So what do we do about this, right? I mean, it sounds like I'm just saying oh yeah, don't bother trying anything because the world sucks. I'm not doom and glooming over here. I'm just saying that we have to look especially at preserving our existing habitats that we have, those little tiny slivers of land that haven't been touched quite yet by us. We have to look at those and really work hard to save those. We need to improve our underperforming habitat with plants that match the local ecology. We can't just slap natives in a site and expect them to do well. If we're dealing with sand dunes on the coast of Lake Michigan, that's a very specific ecosystem with very specific plants that grow there. We can't just go introducing stuff that doesn't natively grow in that site and expect it to, participate in that space without significantly changing that local ecosystem. And we need to defend our existing habitat from development. Just because there's an old farm field out there doesn't mean it has to become a new subdivision. And I see that all the time here in Menominee Falls, is all these old farm fields that are getting turned, like they have all the topsoil scraped off, they have it converted into a like big old subdivision with, you know, all these like 1 acre lot, like massive homes with like 8 bedrooms for families with 1.3 children. You know, it's wasteful, but that's again a totally different issue here. But we have to look at these spaces and say, hey, maybe it doesn't have to just be development for, you know, home construction. Maybe this could become a new park. You know, that we can always have more green spaces. I mean, we have plenty of areas that we've already wrecked and like destroyed the soils of. Maybe we should focus on developing those sites instead of taking the good soil that we have out there. And an important note here is that constructed ecosystems are significantly less efficient and productive than natural ecosystems. It's not a one-to-one ratio of like a constructed wetland versus a wetland destroyed for freeway construction. And again, just because we call wetlands nature's kidneys doesn't mean we can do well with half as many. While looking this up here, I actually found a study coming from, I forget what university it is. Maybe it was from Ohio, but they were saying, oh yeah, we've looked at 2 different sites here. We've got a prairie we've got a wetland site and we've got another one that we've replanted a bunch of natives in and one that we've done nothing with. And after 15 years, well, hey, the biodiversity in these sites is the same. And it seems like we don't really have to do that much work here to get our wetland sites figured out. And I'm sitting here reading this thinking like, wow, gee, it's almost like if I dig a puddle in my backyard and the duck flies in from the local pond, I could say, well, look at this. I got my own little lake here. I don't have to do any work because I've got my own little pond here by just putting the hose out in a puddle. It's kind of cheating when you get to take advantage of the biodiversity that already exists in a site to repopulate your own. So, but again, that's an aside here. I'm going to keep on moving with this. The most important thing that you can do as an individual is think about your actions, okay? Look at what you're doing, what your goals are, and how you're going to get there. But be cognizant of what you're doing and why you're choosing to do what you're doing. Don't just think, I'm going to throw a native in the ground. Be a little bit more thoughtful about it. Think about, what do I want to support out here? What kind of wildlife am I trying to bring into my landscape here? Is it a particular species of butterfly, or am I trying to draw on a certain a bird out here? You know, if you want Kirtland's warbler, I'm sorry, but you have to have way sandier soil to get jack pine for that. That's just the way it goes. But you can support other species around here. And you can also make an effort to make sure that people aren't developing those pine barrens up in northern Wisconsin where the jack pine is an important component of the habitat. So, but enough about all this stuff. We're here to talk about natives and how to use them in the landscape and why they're awesome and everything. So away from the doom and gloom and back towards the fun stuff here. So there are some challenges with using natives in landscape settings, okay? One of the reasons that we use cultivars, again, is that we get a really consistent plant. We have something that we know when it's going to bloom, it's going to have a longer flowering period. The flower structure may be bigger, might be different colors. And again, that brings a whole slew of issues with like, hey, can the insects actually see this flower if it's supposed to be white, but now it's pink? Like, does that really mesh? Do the insects, are they even able to see that color palette there? Who knows? But again, pretty colors are pretty and plants are great, right? So I don't want to get too much into that. But some natives kind of don't look so great on their own. You know, they might not have good aesthetics as an individual plant out there, or they might not be consistent plant to plant. You know, case in point here on the left side, we've got some common snowberries, which you can get this year at the plant sale in a number 2 container. These are kind of spindly plants. They might have a little bit of foliar spots on them because they occasionally get fungal issues on them. It's not a fatal thing for the plant by any means, but you know, it is like a pimple on a plant, basically. You know, it's a little bit unsightly to start with. But if you put one of these out in your front yard where you've got a big foundation shrub, people might look at you like, you know, hey, there's a weed growing in your front bed out there. You should probably rip that out. So with time, they look great, but individually like this, when they're younger, they might leave a little bit to be desired. Same thing goes for American hazelnut. Beautiful fall color on that, but they are kind of a scraggly looking plant. They've got really wonky branching on them. They're not very symmetrical and consistent plant to plant. Really, the only consistent thing, especially with our stuff, because we've been working on the genetics of it, is that it's got that nice fall color to it, and that it produces the hazelnuts. I mean, that's kind of the 2 things that you got guaranteed. But as far as like structure and shape goes, it's kind of all over the place on that plant. So what do we do about that? Well, we plant things in masses. So if you do stuff in a larger group together, that one individual weird looking plant suddenly looks like part of a greater whole, and it starts to match the landscape altogether. So, you know, I couldn't find any really good photos of snowberry in large groups, but here's what I've got here. It's the best I could find out there. But snowberry actually is a really nice, soft textured shrub. It's a really nice, even rounded one. And those little white berries are pretty subtle, but when they're like ripened on the plant, those little specks of white are kind of showy. I mean, it's like Frederick Law Olmsted said, there's a little genius of place with having things that are more subtle that fit with the landscape, rather than throwing out, giant hibiscus flowers all the time, because you suddenly get overwhelmed by all that color. Same thing goes for these hazelnuts here. If you have like a larger massing of plants, or you use it as part of your shrub border, they look great out there. But just putting one out there in the yard by itself might look a little funny to begin with. Other issues that we can run into with our native plants is that they have a shorter period of interest. Again, these plants haven't been selected for long blooming periods. They bloom when it's convenient for them in the landscape, so that they're able to maximize their pollination with native plants, or with our native pollinators out there. So Virginia bluebells and wild geranium both have like a pretty short blooming season in Wisconsin. So what's the solution to that? Well, mixing in other stuff that blooms at a similar time with them, or kind of overlaps with that a little bit. So with bluebells, you probably have a halfway decent site to be growing shooting star in it. And with geranium, if it's on a slope site, maybe you could throw in some prairie smoke out there, because the prairie smoke thrives in a really dry, sharply drained site in full sun. You can have the geranium kind of backing that as you get a little bit more into shade. Plus, in fall, the geranium is just absolutely gorgeous with that fall color. I mean, that's probably one of my favorite natives. And actually, the prairie smoke. Oh, go ahead. Oh, okay. Prairie smoke is really nice too, because it actually will occasionally have like a nice red fall color on it too. So you could get a really nice blend with these different plants here. So again, two issues that we can run into are that the individual plants might look a little messy, or we might have like shorter periods of interest. Well, the solution to both of these problems is to just add more plants, right? So I know it sounds like I'm trying to say just get more plants, which you should get more plants, but it also has a benefit beyond just, you having more plants in your yard. It lends you a longer period of interest. It makes things look a little bit more tied together, and can help give natives more of a formal look in your landscape. So one thing that we'd like to talk about tonight is alternatives to common landscape plants, right? Like we've got burning bush, we've got privet, we've got lilac. Lilac's okay, it's not the worst, but at the same time, it isn't native, even though Idaho has it as their state flower, but I'm not gonna get into that tonight. But we wanna look at what some native plants are that will work in these situations where it's really easy to just recommend an invasive species, or something that's like marginally invasive. Barberry, for example, is a pretty invasive plant. Privet, fairly so. Honeysuckle, absolutely. And then there's other plants that are not on the regulated list, but they are fairly aggressive. I mean, my backyard here in the Falls is filled with a bunch of vinca, which, it's okay. It's not banned in Wisconsin, but man, like it would be great if I could have some other like, native woodland forbs growing out here, rather than just a big old mass of vinca, because it gets kind of boring after a while. So how do you start with picking that alternative? First thing you got to do is look at what you are looking to replace. If your first thought for a space is barberry, why are you picking that? Or if you're talking to someone about it, why are they picking it? Is it because it's colorful? Is it because it's deer resistant? Is it because it's got an attractive fruit display? What is it about that plant that makes it the plant for you? So look at those core features and then figure out which one is important, or at least rank what's most important for you. And from that, you can use that to figure out alternative planting plants. And you're never going to find a 100% one-to-one replacement for a plant. If we had something that was barberry but not invasive, we'd be planting it, but we don't, because barberry is barberry. It's its own unique species. But we might find a plant that actually meets our objectives better than the initial plant that we went to, just because it's so ubiquitous in the landscape. So looking at barberry here, what do we have? We've got a plant with colorful foliage, a finer texture, more of a lower mounded shape here, nice fruit display on it, and deer resistant. What could work as an alternative to this? Well, several things actually. We've got low scape mound chokeberry, which is a cultivar of our native glossy black chokeberry that has a little bit more of a lower mounded habit. That one has phenomenal fall color. It does get browsed on by rabbits a little bit, but once it's established, it's fine. Really pretty flower display that the barberry doesn't have, so that's a bonus for that one here. We've got jewel bush honeysuckle, and this is not invasive honeysuckle. This is our native Deerville alonacera. Jewel is a selection from the now defunct Jewel Nursery in Minnesota, which has a nicer, redder foliage to it, but our native, just Dwarf bush honeysuckle is a great choice too, but I put Jewel here because it's got the colorful foliage on it, of course. But that one's got wonderful flowers for the hummingbirds. It's a deer adapted plant in that if it gets browsed on, it just comes back even thicker and fuller. Nice color, tolerates dry, wet, sun, shade, kind of a really good all-rounder plant. And then we've also got 2 selections from David's lilac out of UW River Falls. For common 9-bark, he's got his raspberry lemonade here with this yellow or chartreuse foliage with these beautiful red ripening fruits on here. So that's a good replacement for those yellow barberries like Tiny Gold and Golden Nugget and whatever other terrible puns people want to come up with. And he's also got Little Devil, which has these really attractive red stems and this purple foliage on it. Again, it's not a one-to-one replacement here, but it is a good alternative. And these might even have something that's more showy than the initial plant you were looking at. We've got Japanese maple. Japanese maple isn't really invasive. It's not really a hugely problematic plant in Wisconsin, but God, those things die if you look at them the wrong way. I mean, it's just not a really tough plant. So if you've got the perfect microsite and you live on Lake Michigan, maybe you can give it a shot. You got some really good drainage in your soil, but lots of organic matter, maybe give it a shot. But don't be mad if it dies on you after like 3-4 years. When I was little growing up in my neighborhood, I remember walking along Washington Boulevard and we'd go past this house that had a beautiful red leaf Japanese maple. And I was like, oh, it's such a pretty plant. Oh, it's such a pretty plant. Wow, it's such a pretty plant. It never grows either. That's so crazy. And I realized like, oh, they just kept replanting it every 2 years. So it was always the same size plant over the span of 10 years in that space. So if you're into that sort of thing, go for it. I mean, people plant annuals, right? So there's nothing wrong with planting a plant to replace it. But if you want something that's going to persist, maybe you look for something different. So what is it about Japanese maple that's appealing? Well, it's got a nice layered texture to it. It's got really pretty branching. It's got colorful foliage. It's got that like tighter, like almost dissected leaf in some cases for some of them, or others just have that palmate leaf texture on them. And good fall color too, even if it's not one of the red leafed ones, they generally all have like a nice yellow to orange to red fall color on them. And small stature. So we've got this list of features here. Well, what's going to be a good replacement? Well, we've got lots actually. We've got our common witch hazel, Hemimelis virginiana, which has a really nice late season bloom, October, November-ish, with these showy little yellow flowers. That one's really exciting because it happens late in the season after you think everything's already gone dormant for the year, right? Now you've got this one putting on fresh flowers. It's a really nice, like coarse textured plant in the winter, so not so great for screening, but it does hold the snow wonderfully. So it's a beautiful plant to have as a specimen. In fact, this plant was so beautiful at the nursery that someone said, I want this, and we dug it out and we planted a new one in its place. So it's one that's gone twice out of that location already. But witch hazel is a great coarser textured plant here, great flowers on it. Mountain maple is a native one as well, and this one has a really showy flower display. It's got these beautiful, like colorful samaras on it. There's a Tatarian maple cultivar called Hot Wings out there that, yeah, Hot Wings is a little bit more adaptable than mountain maple is, but that one was selected for the colorful samaras on it. Well, why don't we plant more mountain maple in those locations, right? Really nice fall color on these as well. Really nice, like a bright fire engine red to like crimson color on them. Then we've got our native striped maple. And this one probably has the form that's probably the most similar to a Japanese maple in like the coarser branching, kind of more of a layered effect to it. Really nice, soft looking foliage here too. A really nice texture overall. And a good, consistent yellow to orange fall color on it. And in the winter without foliage, it's got a really attractive striped bark, which is why it's called striped maple. So these are some good choices for that. And then of course the eponymous euonymus burning bush here. And would you believe it? We actually have a native species of burning bush called Eastern Wahoo. So, if you're ever wondering what's a good plant to plant instead of burning bush, just say Wahoo because you're excited that we've got Eastern Wahoo instead. Now, Eastern Wahoo is a larger plant overall than burning bush, and the new burning bushes are all like compact cultivars with low vigor anyways, because guess what, the bigger ones are invasive. But Eastern Wahoo's a nice one that's got the opposite branching. It's got the great fall color on it, the showy fruit display. Is it as nice looking as the burning bush out there? Not quite, but it's still a nice plant for screening in shady sites, and that's usually what people are planting burning bush for anyway. Sorry, my microphone cut out there for a minute. Then we've got the two, ubiquitous spirea and weigela out there that everyone's got to have in their landscape, right? Well, what do we have instead? We've got potentilla, Dasyphora fruticosa or potentilla fruticosa, depending on how old of a language you want to use to describe that plant. Great for long season blooms, kind of goes all summer long. We've got St. John's wort if you want something a little bit more even and rounded. Great fruit display over the winter, nice yellow flowers in the middle of summer. We've got native spireas. We've got meadowsweet and we've got steeplebush. Meadowsweet having this white flower on it, steeplebush having a pink flower, both of them being more of like a wetter site native plant. So if you've got an area that's consistently moist, then consider planting these for our native spireas. And we've got our witherod viburnum here, which has a wonderful fruit display. And I mean, it goes from like white to pink to, or green to pink to blue all through the span of the season while it's getting fall color on it too. So like half the time I don't even know what to be looking at on this plant because the fall color is happening as it's getting the fruit display, and I'm like, there's way too much going on here. I don't know what to look at. This one here below is called Little, I think it's called Little Ditty, which is a compact selection, but this was the best photo I could find to represent those flowers of a witherod viburnum. And then we've got our bladdernut here, which is a great large-scale native shrub that would be an excellent replacement for anywhere where you've got buckthorn, lilac, privet, hedge cotoneaster, any of those larger, like screening-sized native or like non-native / invasive plants out there. It'll get to be a good like 10, 12 feet tall, 8, 12 feet wide over time, but you can see this is an individual plant right here, not super wide on its own. And there's a lot to love about it. You've got a great, yellow to orange to, if you're really lucky, a red fall color. You've got these beautiful little white creamy flowers on it in spring. And then you've got these really cool Chinese lantern styled fruits on it that kind of give it interest year round. In fact, I found one at the nursery that had fruit on it, and don't tell Ben, but I did grab one of the pods off of it, took it in my backyard and threw some seeds out there. So fingers crossed if something happens with that. If it doesn't, oh well, I tried, and I'll just have to buy one like everybody else. So, but bladdernut's a really awesome plant with a really good bark texture to it, really dense stems on it, so it provides good screening year round. Again, it's not an evergreen, so it's not going to be as thick and full as like say a hemlock or an arborvitae, but hey, buckthorn isn't evergreen either, and people still like to use that or keep it around at least for screening. So why not do a bladdernut instead? So why don't we have lots of cool native cultivars? It sounds like we've got a lot of really awesome stuff to pick from here. Well, it's because plant breeding takes time, and time is money. So it's easier to produce a burning bush than Eastern Wahoo because you can get a reliable liner and seed source. You can just go and call up a liner nursery or another like vendor and say, hey, I need 500 units of compact burning bush. Great, here you go. We've got a crop of 50,000 this year. I'm sending you yours this time. And they perform the same. Euonymus alatus compacta is all the exact same plant. And we've had decades of experience of growing that plant, so we know what we're doing with it. It's not like we have to figure out the perfect recipe for it. It's basically the Kraft mac and cheese of landscape plants, where it's just like, yep, here's how you grow it, and then it's all done, and then you do it again next year. It's an easy sale too because people want it because they see it. And growers grow it because people want it. People see it because growers grow it, and then people want it because they see it. Oh wait, that's right. We've kind of found ourselves in this negative feedback loop here. So it's important to be aware that like the market definitely drives the plant selections out there, and it has been changing lately. We do see a lot more like Aronia cultivars out there and other really neat stuff that we can have in the landscape, but there still is a long way to go. So you picking out those nativars at the grocery store, or at the nursery or wherever you're buying your plants from, even though it's not as good as like planting a pure native, it at least demonstrates through sales to larger plant producers and plant selectors that, hey, people are liking this plant. People are speccing this on jobs. People are planting this in their yard. Maybe we should look into producing more natives or nativar cultivars out there. So a good example of this would be Airwood viburnum, Viburnum dentatum. This is the southern Airwood viburnum, the one that is most common in the landscaping trade. There's lots of cultivars with it. There's Cardinal, Blue Muffin, Autumn Jazz, Red Feather, Little Joe. You want tall ones, short ones, wide ones, round ones, you name it, you got it. And because there's been decades of time spent on selecting these for genetics, they have really good vigor. I mean, these will grow like 2-3 feet a year easy, heck, even more if you've got a really good site for it. Whereas we've got our Rafinesque viburnum, which is our native arrowwood viburnum for Wisconsin. We don't have any cultivars of that. It's not as fast growing. Why is that? Because the only genetics that's been working on that has been, hey, which of these seeds is most likely to reproduce out in the landscape, not which of these seeds was culled out or selected by the nursery producer and said, wow, this is a really vigorous, fast growing plant. I want to grow more of this. So it's a feedback loop, and it's important that you're cognizant of that when you're purchasing plant material so that you know that you're making a purchase that's sending the right signal to growers out there. You know, whether you're buying stuff at, you know, the Fleet Farm parking lot at the middle of summer because everything's half dead and it's all half off anyways, or if you're coming to the nursery and you're buying stuff throughout the year, showing an interest in getting that plant material, or even talking to like your local garden center and saying, hey, I read about this plant. Can I get some little ditty witherod viburnum, or would you guys be able to order in some ground hug aronia for me to plant in my yard? I mean, asking people about this will get them to order more of it in, which will increase demand, which will cause more people to be growing these and shift away resources from growing stuff like, you know, burning bush or fine line buckthorn, which is not really invasive, but that plant sucks for a whole myriad of other reasons, and I'm not going to get into that. Jill, that's a great question. Which viburnum is most resistant to the viburnum leaf beetle? Unfortunately, it seems like the best resistance is coming from the Korean spice viburnums, Viburnum carlesii, which is not native, because that one has a very thick pubescent leaf to it. Although I would say that I don't think we've seen as much damage on black haw viburnum, Viburnum prunifolium. We haven't seen as much on nannyberry, Viburnum lintago, but I don't know if that one's been in the same like it's running in the same landscapes as the arrowwood viburnum, because lintago is more of a like natural site species and arrowwood viburnum is more of a commercial site, parking lot slash, you know, condo development slash, you know, new housing construction, whatever, you know, so they're not really running in the same circles with that insect. But generally, if you're looking at plants that are more resistant to a leaf beetle or any like kind of chewing insect, you want something that's got like a thicker cuticle to it, which is that waxy coating of the leaf. You want something that's got a thicker leaf in general, something that might be a little bit glossier looking, because those tend to be a little bit more difficult for the insects to be feeding on. Whereas, you know, arrowwood viburnum has like a pretty thin, easy to munch on leaf. I mean, it's a pretty tasty plant out there. And unfortunately, Rafinesque viburnum seems to also be susceptible to that insect as well. So it'll be interesting to see what happens in the next 5-year period as far as how that insect goes. And yeah, double file might be a good one too. That's not one that we produce at the nursery, but it is one that if you're able to get it, it's a really cool plant to try out if you've got like kind of a good microsite for it too. So definitely try out different stuff and see what's willing to grow out there in the landscape. So what about nearly native plants, right? I mean, we've talked all this time about natives and why they're great for our landscapes, but there's some stuff where it's not native to Wisconsin, but it might be pretty darn close up here. And plants don't really care about, you know, borders. They don't really pay attention to where the line between Wisconsin and Iowa and Illinois and Minnesota are. They just kind of grow over their natural range where climate affords it. And insects and butterflies and birds and animals out there, they don't really pay attention to those borders either. They go where the plant species will support their lives. So being aware of where there might be that like little bit of overlap and there might be that little bit of range that you could extend it up a little bit further is important to think about. So one example, this would be bottlebrush buckeye. This is great for swallowtail butterflies. They love the flowers on this plant. It's a nice, big, beefy, shade-tolerant shrub that gets 15 feet wide, 10 feet tall, grows in a nice drier site. My parents have a pretty tough site on the north side of their home in Milwaukee. It's an old house built in like the 1920s. The soil around it is pretty gray and depleted. There's a couple of big spruce trees, keeps the soil fairly dry, and nothing has really ever grown on the north side of that house except for bottlebrush buckeye, which I planted 3 of them there last year. They seem to do pretty well through the year. I'm hoping that once they get established, they won't need as much watering and they'll be able to just kind of thrive in that space and provide good shading and screening. And in the winter, when you're kind of really hungering for as much light as possible in the house, it's a really coarse textured plant. So it'll let a lot of natural light in, even on that north side of the home. So fingers crossed that this one works out in that space. I will let you all know after I've given it a trial for a couple of years. But bottlebrush buckeye is a really great large-scale native plant, or large-scale nearly native plant that will give you really great fall color, provides habitat for butterflies and hummingbirds with that wonderful flower on it, and it's just great from a screening standpoint. We've also got Northern Catalpa, which I'm sure that many of you have already seen this plant growing out there in the landscape, but if you haven't, this is the one with the big, huge, 12-inch heart-shaped leaves, flowers that are the size of a $50, and bean pods that are, probably 14 inches long. So some people will call it a messy tree, and I'm not going to say it's not, but it is a fairly fast-growing plant. Actually, it's a really fast-growing plant, not even fairly. It's adaptable to a wide variety of sites. The only downfall of it is that it is highly susceptible to verticillium wilt. So if you've got that, don't plant this. But Northern Catalpa is a great plant. I mean, the flowers themselves are a wonderful, good source of nectar and pollen for our pollinators out there. And it's a really showy, pretty plant. So a good one to plant out in those tougher sites. Eastern redbud's another one too. We've got, the Eastern redbud isn't native to Wisconsin, even though there is that Columbus strain of it that was an older population growing in Columbus that was planted there a while back. But redbud is a legume. It does, help build up the soil a little bit. It's great for dry alkaline clay sites. It tolerates shade. It's a great early bloomer. The flowers on it are edible. There's a lot of benefits to having these plants and incorporating them in the landscape. I'm not saying line your entire property with redbud, but throw one of them out there. Enjoy that plant in the landscape for one of the really early blooms of the season. And the flowers really taste pretty good. They're if you ever had a fresh snap pea, it's a little bit sweeter than that. So it's a really good garnish on a salad. We've also got bald cypress, Taxodium. This plant isn't native to Wisconsin. It's definitely more of a southern species, but they seem to grow decently up here in the right site. So really nice, softer textured foliage, a good component for diversity, really pretty bark on it as well. And I have seen a lot of animals and insects hanging out in there. I mean, they're not munching on it as much as a native cherry tree or an oak or whatnot. But if you already have cherries and oaks in your yard, throw a bald cypress out there. If you ever wanted to see a gorgeous one, if you're ever up in Menominee Falls, go to Town Hall Road. If you're coming on Main Street, go to Town Hall Road, head south on there, and then turn left onto Menominee Avenue. There is a beautiful one on the north side of the street that, I mean, it's got to be 2 feet in diameter, 50, 60 feet tall, but it's just such a beautiful symmetrical plant out there. It's absolutely gorgeous. So Royal Catchfly is another great near native as well. This is a really wonderful mid-season bloomer with this red flower on it. I mean, it is a very red flower on here. I always kind of had oh yeah, it's kind of a cool plant when I was at the nursery in the summer, because what will happen with this is it'll grow tall, it'll bloom, but it'll be really spindly, and it kind of flops around in a container. It's not really that sturdy on its own. So I was well, okay, it's a red flower that's cool, I guess, but it's not really anything to write home about. Well, boy, was I wrong, because I saw a planting of it with a bunch of other rain garden plants in Oconomowoc on Lake Fowler. If you're ever in their little open market square area down there. On the shore of the lake, they've got some rain gardens. They've got wild senna growing in there. They've got liatris, blazing star. They've got, I don't think they've got, maybe they might have some rosinweed out there. Anyways, they got lots of cool stuff out there. But they also have royal catchfly mixed in with it. And man, this is a beautiful plant to have in that site, because this red just contrasts with all of the purples and yellows that you usually see in the landscape that, it just is a standout color. I mean, it really catches your eye. It's these little starbursts of red throughout the planting out there. It's not super floriferous, it's not the big spike of flowers on a blazing star, but it is a really showy plant to add to any area where you've got good drainage, like a rain garden. So definitely look at considering this one for your landscape, just if it's just one or two of them out there. So if we want to design for lower maintenance, the best thing you can do is to pick the right plants for your space. So, Plants that are enjoying where they're living are less likely to have problems, just like how people who are happy and healthy tend to have less health problems because they're enjoying their life and not hating every second of it. There are also some basic things you can do to make sure your beds are kept easy, though, which is watering the right amount to establish your plants in the first place, using a bark mulch to protect roots from heat, not a stone mulch. Don't use stone mulch. Use a bark mulch, or at worst wood chips, but don't use stone mulch. I mean, I see that in a lot of places where it's like, oh, I use stone mulch, like it keeps the weeds down. I'm like, well, no, the weed barrier you put down keeps the weeds down. And the stone does literally nothing for the soil out there. I mean, it's if you're doing a stone bed in like a rain garden, great. Like if you want to have that be where your water is drying or is flowing on, like a dry riverbed, awesome. That's phenomenal. But don't grow your plants in it because stone mulch literally does nothing for the plant out there aside from make the ground heat up faster and dry out sooner. Um, and lastly, you want to keep your soils healthy, uncompacted, adequate moisture and organic matter. Make sure you've got like set paths through your garden. Don't just walk wherever you want to willy-nilly through there. You want to keep that soil pretty loose. You want to make sure you've got that bark mulch breaking down, keeping that soil biologically active so that things are keeping everything awake. Pine straw is a good mulch to use. I've used that down in South Carolina. It's if it's like economical for you to use, great. I think the ones that I used when I was down there was I want to say slash pine, the like huge 16-inch long needles on there. So if you have access to that and it's economical for you, great. I know people have been big onto the whole like cocoa bean mulch too, but you know that's like getting kind of expensive for a small bag of it. Like if you want to add a little texture into your landscape, great, cool, but it might get pretty cost prohibitive to do your entire landscape in just that mulch. And then the question was, what benefits does the bald cypress have over dawn redwood? I would say that bald cypress is a little bit more drought tolerant. It's a little bit narrower in terms of shape. It's not as coarse textured, and I would say it's a little bit hardier winter-wise. Dawn redwood occasionally will die back in Wisconsin, whereas I haven't really seen that problem on bald cypress. But both are great plants. I love both of them. I have dawn redwoods planted on my family's land because I love that plant and I love looking at it. So don't get me wrong on that one. It's just knowing the right plant for the right space out there. All right, so then how much water do you actually need for a site to do well? It depends. So you want to have roughly 1 inch of water a week for newly establishing plants. The question is like what level of that is right? Like how much water do we need to be providing out there in the landscape for these plants? And it depends on the size that we're doing out there. If you're doing like perennials or shrubs, then you know, just kind of using a shower head on your hose is good enough for that. But for trees, you want to go more with like, you know, 10 gallons per inch of caliper per trees, and caliper is the diameter of the trunk, 6 inches above grade. It depends on the site as well. So if you're dealing with small plants such as plugs, you want to water more often and you want to use less water on each interval because you don't want to drown out these plants unless you have, you know, pretty good drainage there. Whereas if you have large plants, you want to water less frequently, but you want to provide more water at each of those watering instances. You know, the trees prefer infrequent, deep, slow watering. So using a soaker hose is great if you can do that for, you know, like 8 hours or so and let that really drain into that soil is great. If you've got compacted and poorly drained soil where water like will run off if you put too much of it down and it takes a while for it to infiltrate, you want to water less frequently and you want to water slowly, like really slowly for that space. Because that soil is going to hold a lot more moisture. Like once it does get saturated, it's going to hold on to a lot of water in general. Whereas sharply drained soils, you're going to want to water more as well. But you're going to want to water those slowly too, because with the sharply drained sites, the water is flowing like right through that soil out of there. If you water fast, that's putting like 10 gallons out there and letting it just rush right through. Whereas if you water slowly, it's putting that 10 gallons out there for that tree to really soak up through its roots. They can only draw in so much in a moment that they can get. If you've got a really hot site out there, you want to water it more often and you want to use more water, but you want to make sure you're watering in the morning because that's when you're going to like feed those plants best for the day and they're going to be able to use that water over the span of the day as the sun gets hotter and hotter. If you water them while it's like already pretty hot out, it's kind of like, well, you're hitting the fire alarm after the building's already fallen down. You know, it's kind of like a little late for that. Better than not doing anything, but you know, you still would be better off watering it early in the morning. And if you have a cool shaded site, then you want to water less often and you want to use less water because the shade is preserving more of that soil moisture. And you're not having to worry about like that significant transpiration happening as much. And Dana, I'll pop up a link here. I'll point out where that is on Google Maps here in a minute. So as far as watering goes, I've got a handy dandy guide here. If anyone wants this, I can provide it to the staff at Western Great Lakes Bird and Bat Observatory as well. But this is just meant to be like a general guide on how much water to be using. It all depends on your site and what to be doing for each plant. But if you're totally stumped on how many gallons you need for a certain plant, then you know you can look at this and get a rough idea off of that. So I'll provide this to folks after the fact if they want to look at it, but it's a handy resource to have. And what if you have deer and rabbits? Well, you can pick plants that are animal resistant. You know, they might have a lot of prickers on it, like prickly ash. They might have a nasty or bad taste to them, or they might be poisonous in the case of, well, that's not a native plant. I was about to say Fisher monkshood, but that's not native. Baneberry. Baneberry is toxic. But you can also pick plants that are animal adapted. I had a customer 3-4 years ago that had, they planted a bunch of dwarf bush honeysuckle around their house as like kind of a ground cover. They called me back the next year and they said, hey, half of these look like crap and half of these look good. And I was like, well, geez, that's weird. Let me come on out and take a look at it. Walk around, look at them. I'm like, oh, here's your problem. The ones that look like crap didn't get touched in the winter, and the ones that look great got eaten by the deer. And when the deer ate the tops of them off, they flushed out and filled out like 3 times as big. Aspens, when they're rubbed by deer, they sucker and spread, and they'll form a denser colony. Same thing goes for sumac. And with dogwoods, they grow back twice as dense when they're browsed because they're oppositely branched. So deer will come through, they'll nip the tops off of those plants, and guess what? They're pruning it for density for you, which means you're going to get more flowers and more fruits on it for birds. So it's kind of this nice synergistic relationship there. Well, how are you supposed to arrange all this, right? I mean, we've talked about natives, we talked about how to design like a lower maintenance landscape for you, but how do you plan out that landscape? Well, some people like houses that look like this. Some people like houses that look like this. And some people like houses that look like this. It's up to you. So there's really no like right or wrong way to design stuff. Yeah, there's the whole like odd numbers of like, oh yeah, plant in 1, 3, 5, 7, 9. But you know, if you got room for 3, or if you got room for 4, plant 4. If you don't have room for 5, like don't get caught up on the, oh, I can't plant in weird numbers, or plant 3, leave a little space and then plant 1. You got 4 in that space that fit, but you've actually got a group of 1 plus 3, and you know, you've kind of cheated that. So do what you want to do. It's your landscape. If you need a little guidance or a little help, like walk through like your neighborhood and take a look at how things are arranged and decide if you want to do like more of a matrix planting or a grouping. But there's lots of resources out there online for different design methods that you can be using. So there's a lot of different ways you can design a landscape. The good thing is that it's up to you on how to do that. You can do it like naturally if you want. You can do it very formally and arranged. But it's your call. It's your yard. And if someone's going to come to you and tell you your landscaping like doesn't look good, tell them like get off your property. Like you know, it's whatever you want to do out there. So with that, that's the end of my presentation, and I am happy to answer questions. And really quick, let me figure out where this dawn redwood or this bald cypress is, because I love this plant and I definitely want to show it off more. So yeah, if you are in Menominee Falls, let me share my screen quick here again. So you've got Menominee Falls here, you've got 41 over this way. If you get off on Main Street or Pilgrim, you take it down over here, you've head through the downtown area, across where the Mill Pond Dam is, get on Main Street. You can either take Shady Lane or you can take Town Hall Road over here down. But the tree is located right over here on Menominee Avenue. So I'll pull this up over here quick. and it is just absolutely gorgeous, like 10 out of 10. If I can figure out where it is here. Ah, yeah, here it is. Look at that. Just a gorgeous tree. I mean, just looks phenomenal with leaves on it, without leaves on it. We moved here last summer, and like it's probably been one of my favorite things driving to work every morning is just looking at this tree because I get to drive past it every day. And it is absolutely a gorgeous plant. I mean, look at the bark on there. It's just great in every sense of the word. So, all right, awesome. And thank you all so much for having me.
Eric, I think there's one question that might not have gotten answered.
Mhm.
Or maybe I missed it. Is there an easy, someone asked, is there an easy way to tell the difference between invasive and native burning bush?
That I don't know off the top of my head. I think it might be the wings on the twig. I think that the burning bush has like much more pronounced wings on it, whereas the eastern wahoo does not. Let me get the. I'm gonna have to ask Ben that, but I can definitely find that out from him and then get back with you on there because I'm sure he's got like a super easy way to do it that I've just never had to use before because I don't ever really see eastern wahoo out there. So it's not like I have to worry about too much.
Totally understandable. And we send out an email to everyone with link to the recording survey and any answers to questions and things like that that the speakers have. So if you wanted to provide that information and your watering guide, we would love to share that with folks because I'm sure that would be helpful to people too.
Perfect, perfect. So I will find out burning bush. I'm just writing this down over here versus wahoo, and I will send the watering guide to you after the fact. You'll be able to provide that to folks. So.
Someone is asking if they can ask a question about a specific shrub. I think the answer is yes.
Absolutely. It's my second favorite thing to talk about after trees. Well, third favorite thing after trees and conifers. But
Jean and Dennis.
Yes, I'm typing now.
You can just ask. That's okay.
Oh, okay. We have a forsythia shrub that is quite a number of years old. I'm guessing maybe 15 to 16 years old. And probably the last 7 or 8, we've had trouble with the flowering on it. Very little flowers. We've tried numerous things to do. My thinking is that perhaps it's old and tired and we should just pull it over and start over. But I don't know what, if you have any suggestions that maybe we haven't tried.
yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. With those older shrubs like that, especially with the forsythia, because forsythia is kind of like marginally hardy for its flower buds anyway. So if it's been like really exposed in winter, like you haven't had any flowers on it at all, or you've had like some on the lower part of it?
Very few. And not necessarily just on the lower part, on the outer edges in the spring when it starts to bloom, on the outer edges of the branches. But that's about, and some right at the very top, but that's about it. And it's very sparse. It is exposed in the wintertime. Well, sort of exposed in the wintertime. It sits in a corner and there's fence on either side of the corner, but there is a lake breeze that comes through that corner too.
Yeah, so it might be winter damage because the buds are marginal on them, but it might also be because it's an older plant. So if you're going to try to rejuvenate that one, what I would do is I would wait until right after it's done flowering this year, then cut it down to the ground, because then it'll re-sprout, it'll set flower buds for next year, and if it blooms next spring, then great, it worked, and if it doesn't, well, then you just plant a new plant in that space that's going to have better flowering to it. So if you want like a nice early season bloomer, you could look at doing like American plum if you wanted to do a Wisconsin native. That one has phenomenal white blooms on it in the season or in spring. Otherwise, a service berry is a really nice early blooming species as well. So.
Okay. I mean, this is old enough that we would not be able to cut back down to the ground. We would have to literally, the trunk on it is so big, we'd have to literally have it pulled out.
Well, if you got like a chainsaw or if you got like a nice like handsaw,
Yeah.
you could cut it flush
Yeah.
with the ground. But basically, you're opening it up so that there's room for like new shoots to come up from the ground around it.
Okay.
So that's
if it
the
doesn't
goal with that.
Try chainsawing it down to the ground and then see what happens. Okay. That's something
Yeah.
we, of course, we have not tried yet. So thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And if it doesn't work, then well, I'm sorry, but then you can do at least you have a chance to try out a different plant in that space. So.
Right. Okay. All right. Thank you. Very helpful.
Yeah, you're welcome.
There was another question about how do you propagate Eastern Wahoo?
That is definitely a great question for Ben. That's not one that I'm able to answer because he's the one that knows all the magic tricks on how to grow different plants out there.
Okay.
Yeah, if I looked it up, I'd probably just be reading out of the DUR manual here. But yeah, I'm sure Ben has like all the secrets and tips to it. And let's see. Yeah, if you want to have people just email you, Jen, and you can just forward it to me, I can pass that along to Ben and get that info and at least get the answers to folks on those specific questions if they have those too.
Yeah, definitely.
I'm not the propagator. I'm just the person that talks about plants. Ben's the one that actually knows how to make the magic happen. So.
Perfect. We would be happy to do that. I guess one that you might be able to help out with is what is an alternative plant for forsythia?
It's a great question. What are we planting forsythia for? Is it for screening? Is it for big shrub? Is it for early spring flowers on it? Like, what are we looking to get out of it? So we want to look at those questions first, and then from there we'll determine what's a good option for that. So yeah, if you're looking for early flowers, then you're probably going to want to look at, I would say that serviceberry is a really good choice for that, just because serviceberry is a really early season bloomer. Plus you got the fruits on it that the birds will love too. There are some smaller ones like Amelancher, I think it's Amelancher alnifolia. There's like Regent Saskatoon serviceberry, which is kind of a rounder shrub that's a little bit more tidy and maintained, but you could also do just the native running serviceberry if you've got the room for it, because that one will get to be a pretty large size and it has a nice foliage on it. And it's great for dry sites too, which is usually hard to get a plant that like flowers reliably in like a drier site out there. If you're looking for non-native, you could look at doing Cornelian cherry dogwood. That one is like a really reliable early spring flowering yellow flowering tree. Like I would plant that one over a forsythia like 10 times out of 10 because it blooms earlier, it's 100% bud hardy, and you can use the fruits on it to make a really delicious wine if you want to add like 10 pounds of sugar to it, which that's kind of how wine works in general, but especially for that one. So, and yeah, glossy black chokeberry is a great one too, although that one does flower after the leaves come out on it, so you will wait a little bit more, whereas forsythia is like no leaves on the plant, just flowers. So it's kind of like competing with your serviceberry, with your calorie pears. Ugh, hate that plant, but whatever. Crab apples a little bit, although those are starting to leaf out just a hair when they're going. But there's also plenty of like early flowering like perennials and bulbs and stuff that you can do too that might be worth looking into, because don't look at it just from a shrub is the answer for flowering, because you might have something that produces an early, heck, even pussy willow is kind of a neat one because the flowers in it, they're not like a traditional flower, but they're a really interesting, unique texture to have out there. Magnolia too, it's not native, but at least it's not super problematic in our landscapes. So there's that as well.
Okay, I think that's all of the questions. Thank you so much, Erik. And I know I've learned a lot, so hopefully other people have too. And we'll get those answers out to everyone.
Wonderful. Thank you all for having me. This was a blast. Appreciate it.